The silence of the New Mexico desert was not an absence of sound, but a presence of it. It was the low, ceaseless moan of the wind as it scraped across sandstone and cholla, a sound that had been Clara's only companion for 3 days. It whispered through the tatters of what was once a wedding dress, its fine lace now snagged and brown with dust, the silk hem shredded by unforgiving scrub. The dress was a mockery, a ghost of a life she had refused to live, and now it felt like a shroud she would be buried in. Her horse, a stout mare named Patience, had lived up to her name until she could not an hour ago. The mare had given a great, shuddering sigh that seemed to tear from the very depths of her soul, her legs buckling without grace. She had not fallen, but rather folded into the earth, her dun hide blending with the ochre dust. Clara had knelt beside her, stroking the velvet of her nose, her own throat too tight with thirst and grief to make a sound. There was no water for the horse, just as there was barely any left for her. The canteen sloshing against her hip was a liar, its contents warm and meager, a final, cruel joke played by a merciless sun. She had taken the bridle, a useless token of their journey together, and left the mare to the circling buzzards that had already begun to sketch lazy circles against the vast, indifferent blue sky. Now, she walked. Each step was a negotiation with the sand that shifted under the worn soles of her lady's boots. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her uncovered head, her hair a tangled nest of auburn that offered no protection. The world had bleached itself of color, leaving only shades of red, brown, and a blinding, shimmering white where the light hit the ground. She was 19 years old, and she felt as ancient as the weathered rock formations that dotted the horizon, carved by eons of the same wind that now stole the moisture from her lips and burned the tears from her eyes before they could fall. She had been running from a man whose hands were as cold as his eyes, a wealthy landowner her father had deemed a suitable match. He was a man who looked at her not as a woman, but as a fine piece of property, another horse to be broken, another field to be plowed. The thought of his touch, of the life that awaited her in his grand, empty house, had been a spur more potent than any her father could have used. So she had fled. Taking the horse meant to be part of her dowry and a dress she was meant to be married in. A desperate, ill-planned flight into the unknown. The unknown, she was discovering, was a far more patient and thorough predator than the man she had left behind. Her world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. The horizon shimmered, playing tricks on her. She saw lakes that vanished as she drew closer, trees that dissolved into heat haze. Her thirst was a living thing inside her, a clawed beast tearing at her throat. She had stopped thinking about being found by her father's men. She had started thinking only of water, of shade, of an end to the walking. It was then, as the sun began its slow, grudging descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, that she saw it. Not a mirage this time. It was the thin, dark finger of smoke, rising steadily from behind a massive outcrop of red rock that jutted from the desert floor like a broken tooth. Hope was a dangerous thing. It made you careless. It made you run when you should walk. Spend the last of your energy on a gamble. Clara did not run. She no longer had the strength, but her steps quickened, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant a person. A person was a chance for water, or a chance for a new kind of danger. In the desert, they were often one and the same. As she drew nearer, the shape of the rock formation became clearer. It offered a deep, crescent-shaped shadow, a natural shelter from the relentless sun and the scouring wind. And in that shadow, a figure moved, a man. Her breath hitched. She slowed, trying to melt into the landscape, her tattered white dress making a mockery of any attempt at stealth. She could make out details now. A small fire, crackling merrily. The source of the smoke, a bedroll laid out near the rock wall. And the man himself. He was broad-shouldered, his back to her. The setting sun cast his skin in bronze, sweat glistening on the hard planes of his muscles. He wore no shirt, only dark, dusty trousers and worn boots. He was kneeling, his attention focused entirely on the task at hand. In one hand, he held a long, wicked-looking knife. In the other, a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was a sharp, clean sound that cut through the wind's moan. Beside the fire, a rabbit was spitted on a stick, its meat slowly turning, dripping fat that sizzled and spat in the flames. Clara watched, frozen, 100 feet away. Every instinct screamed at her. A lone man in the wilderness was not to be trusted. He was a wolf, a predator, and she was a lamb, lost and wounded. Her father had warned her of such men without law or God, who took what they wanted without asking. This man, with his bare back and his gleaming knife, looked like the very embodiment of those warnings. But her body betrayed her. Her knees trembled, not from fear alone, but from an exhaustion so profound it felt like a sickness of the bone. The smell of the roasting meat reached her, and the beast of hunger in her belly roared, momentarily drowning out the whisper of caution. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, not since the last of the hardtack she'd stolen from the wagon train had run out. He had not seen her. He finished sharpening his knife, testing the edge with a careful thumb before wiping it clean on his trousers and setting it down. He turned his attention to the spit, giving it a slow rotation. He was methodical, unhurried, a man completely at home in this desolate place. He moved with a quiet economy of motion that spoke of long practice and a deep-seated competence. He was a part of this landscape, as much as the rock and the sand. She was the intruder, the alien thing, a fragile piece of civilization breaking apart under the strain of the wild. She had to make a choice. To turn back was to walk toward certain death in the coming cold of the desert night. To go forward was to place her life, what little of it she had left, into the hands of a complete stranger. She thought of the man she was supposed to marry, his soft hands and cruel smile. She thought of this man, his back scarred with faint, pale lines she could just make out in the fading light, his hands calloused, incapable as they tended his fire. She did not know which was the greater danger, but only one of them offered the possibility of water. Taking a ragged breath that felt like breathing in dust, she took a step forward, then another. Her boots made no sound in the soft sand. He still hadn't noticed her. The firelight flickered across his face now as he leaned in to check the meat, and she saw a strong jawline dark with stubble, a straight nose, and eyes shadowed by the brim of a hat that lay on the ground beside him. He looked young, perhaps only a few years older than herself, but there was a hardness to him, a stillness that made him seem older. She was 20 feet away when her body made the decision for her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the world tilting and blurring at the edges. The ground rushed up to meet her, but she didn't feel the impact. Her legs simply gave out, and she crumpled into the dust, not with a cry, but with a soft, defeated sigh, like the last breath of her fallen horse. The scrape of a boot on stone was the first sound she registered. Then, a shadow fell over her. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her head spinning. He was standing over her now, a tall silhouette against the fiery sunset. He hadn't moved quickly. There was no alarm in his posture, only a quiet watchfulness. His eyes, she could see them now, were the color of faded denim, narrowed as he took in her torn dress, her sunburnt face, her chapped lips. He held the spit with the rabbit in one hand, his knife tucked into the sheath on his belt. He looked from her to the empty expanse of desert she had come from, then back to her. She braced herself for the questions, for the rough hands, for the sneer or the demand. She expected him to ask who she was, what she was running from, what she had to offer. She expected him to see her as a prize, a problem, or a meal. He did none of those things. For a long moment, he just looked, his expression unreadable. Then, he moved the spit to his other hand, freeing the one closest to her. He crouched down. not too close, respecting a space she hadn't even known she needed. He didn't offer to help her up. He didn't touch her. He simply extended his open, calloused hand, palm up, a gesture that was neither a command nor a plea. It was an invitation. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, like gravel washed in whiskey. It was the first human voice she had heard in days, and it anchored her to the spinning world. He didn't ask a single question. Sit a spell, miss. His words hung in the air, simple and direct, yet they seemed to carry the weight of the entire desert. Clara stared at his outstretched hand. It was a working man's hand, wide and calloused, the knuckles scarred, the skin tanned to the color of worn leather. It was not the soft, pale hand of the man she had fled, a hand that had always felt like a clammy cage closing around hers. This hand was an anchor, an offer of solid ground in a world that had turned to shifting sand beneath her feet. Still, she could not take it. To accept his touch felt like a surrender, a concession she was not yet willing to make. Ignoring the offered hand, she used her own trembling arms to push herself into a sitting position. The effort sent a fresh wave of dizziness through her, and the campfire-lit scene swam before her eyes. She squeezed them shut for a moment, waiting for the world to steady. When she opened them again, his hand was gone. He had retracted it without any sign of offense, his expression as impassive as the rock face behind him. He simply rose to his full height and turned back to the fire, taking the spit of roasting rabbit from its perch over the flames. He used his long knife to deftly carve off a portion of the meat, placing it on a tin plate that had seen better days. He then picked up a canteen, not the near-empty one at her own hip, but a larger, heavier one of his own, and filled a tin cup. He set both the plate and the cup on the ground near her, a careful distance away, before returning to his own spot by the fire with his share of the meal. He ate with the same quiet efficiency with which he did everything, his focus on his food, his gaze directed into the crackling flames. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. It was no longer just the absence of her footsteps or the breathing of her horse. It was a silence charged with the presence of another human being. Clara's hunger was a physical pain, a hollow ache that gnawed at her insides. The aroma of the roasted meat was maddening, a torment and a temptation. For a full minute, she simply stared at the plate. It was a test, she thought, a trap. Nothing was given for free in this world. Her father had taught her that lesson well. Every meal had a price, every kindness a hidden hook. She looked at the man, trying to decipher the angle, the trick. But he offered nothing. He did not look at her, did not urge her to eat. He simply sat there, a silhouette against the fire, contained and complete in his own world. He seemed to ask for nothing, expect nothing. Finally, the gnawing hunger won out over the deep-seated suspicion. Her hands shook as she reached for the plate. The meat was hot, savory, and she devoured it without grace, the juices running down her chin. She did not care. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. When the meat was gone, she picked up the cup. The water was cool and clean, and she drank it in slow, careful sips, forcing herself not to gulp it down and make herself sick. It was like drinking life itself, each swallow soothing the raw, burning fire in her throat. When she was finished, she set the empty plate and cup back where he had placed them. He gave a slight nod, a bare acknowledgement, before he stood up and took them, rinsing them with a splash of water from his canteen and packing them away in a worn leather saddlebag. He moved with a purpose that made her feel clumsy and useless. He was a creature of this wilderness, and she was a hothouse flower, wilted and out of place. Now that the immediate, desperate needs of her body had been met, fear began to creep back in, cold and sharp. The sun had vanished completely, and the desert had been swallowed by an immense, star-dusted darkness. The fire was their whole world, a small island of light and warmth in an ocean of black. The flames threw long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar shapes of sagebrush and rock into monstrous figures. The wind picked up, its moan now carrying a distinct chill. She shivered, pulling the tattered remnants of her dress closer around her. A futile gesture. The man, Wade he'd be called in a town, she reckoned, seemed oblivious to the cold. He was checking the rigging on his saddle, his fingers moving with practiced surety over the straps and buckles. He had a horse, a tall, dark shape that stood tethered just beyond the circle of firelight, its occasional soft snort the only sound besides the wind and the crackling wood. He was preparing. But for what? Was he planning to leave her here? The thought sent a jolt of panic through her that was even colder than the night air. To be left alone now would be a death sentence. He finished with his saddle and turned his attention to his rifle, a long, heavy-looking firearm. He broke it down with economical movements, cleaning the parts with an oiled rag. The metallic clicked sharp and ominous in the quiet. Every action spoke of a man who relied on no one but himself, a man who was prepared for violence, who likely lived with it as a constant companion. And here she was, a woman, alone and defenseless, completely at his mercy. She huddled closer to the fire, avoiding his eyes, afraid of what she might see in them if he looked at her, and even more afraid of what he might see in hers. She felt raw, exposed, stripped of all the layers of propriety and protection that had defined her life. He would ask soon. He would demand to know her name, where she came from, why a girl in a wedding dress was wandering his desert. And when he found out she had nothing, no family to ransom her, no money to pay him, what then? What would he take as payment? She trembled, and this time it was not from the cold. He finished with the rifle, reassembling it with a final, satisfying snap. He leaned it against the rock wall within easy reach. Then he looked at her. It was not a glance, but a long, steady gaze. His eyes, in the flickering firelight, seemed to hold no malice, only a quiet, unnerving curiosity. It was the look of a man studying a strange bird that had fallen into his camp, trying to decide if it was wounded or dangerous, or both. The silence stretched, pulling taut between them. She knew she had to be the one to break it. She had to offer something, some explanation, to fill the void before he filled it with his own assumptions. "I need a place to stay," she said, her voice a dry, reedy whisper she barely recognized as her own. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing a sliver of strength into the words. "Just for the night." He held her gaze for another moment, then gave that same small nod. It was a gesture of such finality, such simple acceptance, that it caught her completely off guard. There were no follow-up questions, no demands for more information, just a nod. He accepted her statement as the whole and complete truth, or perhaps he simply did not care for the details. He reached for a thick, woolen blanket from his bedroll. For a terrifying second, she thought he was going to bring it to her, to come close, to loom over her again. Instead, he simply gave it a toss. It landed in a heap on the sand a few feet from her. Then he turned his back on her. It was the most profound gesture he could have made. He walked to the edge of the firelight and sat down, his back against the rock face, facing out into the darkness. He was a sentinel, a guard. He placed himself between her and the vast, unknown dangers of the desert night. "You can sleep by the fire," he said, his voice carrying back to her, low and steady. "I'll keep watch from here." Clara stared at his back, a broad expanse of muscle and sun-darkened skin. He had given her food, water, the warmth of his fire, and a blanket. He had asked for nothing in return, and now he was offering her protection, not just from the wilderness, but from himself. He had built an invisible wall between them with his own body. This unexpected decency was more unnerving than any threat could have been. It chipped away at the defenses she had so carefully constructed. She had been prepared for a monster, for a brute who would see her as a thing to be used. She had a small, sharp pin hidden in the bodice of her dress, a pathetic weapon she had planned to use if the worst came to pass. But she had no defense against this quiet, gruff kindness. Why? The question screamed in her mind. No man was this decent without a reason. Was this some kind of elaborate trick? Was he lulling her into a false sense of security, waiting for her to fall asleep? The thought made her skin crawl. She watched his unmoving back, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He did not move, save for the slow, steady rise and fall of his shoulders as he breathed. He seemed carved from the same stone he leaned against. The confusion and the fear and the exhaustion warred within her, creating a pressure that had to escape. The question that had been circling in her mind, the one she was most afraid to ask, finally broke free. Why, the word was barely a breath. He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. Why what? Why don't you? She struggled for the words, her face burning with heat that had nothing to do with the fire. How could she ask such a thing? How could she voice the ugly fear that had been her constant companion? Why aren't you bothering me? The silence that followed her question was different. It was heavy, weighted. She thought for a moment that he wouldn't answer, that she had offended him, or worse, given him ideas. She regretted speaking instantly, wishing she could pull the words back from the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, rougher around the edges. He still did not turn. That dress you're wearing, the way you look when you think I'm not watching, tells me you've been running from a man. He paused, letting the words sink in. He knew. He had looked at her and seen not just a woman in a torn dress, but the story behind it. And it tells me something else, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. Tells me you ain't never been with a man before. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. His perception was so sharp, it felt like a violation, laying bare the very thing she had fought so hard to protect. She wrapped her arms around herself, a useless shield. He finally turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. In the firelight, his eyes were dark and serious, stripped of all impassivity. The casual observer was gone, replaced by a man who saw right through her. The first time a man lays his hands on you. Miss, he said, his voice deliberate and clear, cutting through the sound of the wind. It ought to be because you chose him. It ought to be someone you walked toward with your head held high, not some stranger you collapsed in front of because you had nowhere else to run. He turned back to face the darkness. The conversation declared over. Clara sat in stunned silence, the woolen blanket forgotten beside her. His words echoed in her mind, dismantling every fear, every cynical expectation she had about him. He had not just offered her safety, he had offered her respect. He had seen her not as an opportunity, but as a person, one who deserved a choice, a say in her own life, in a world that had tried to take all her choices away. This stranger, this rough, silent man in the middle of nowhere, had just given one back to her. She looked at the fire, its flames no longer seeming menacing. They were just light, just warmth. She looked at his back, a solid, unmoving presence against the vast and threatening dark. And for the first time in a very long time, the trembling inside her began to subside. Sleep did not come easily. Clara drifted in and out of a shallow, restless slumber. The hard ground, an unwelcome mattress, and the strange, guttural cries of distant coyotes, a haunting lullaby. Yet, each time her eyes fluttered open, the first thing she saw was his silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. He remained a steadfast sentinel, his back to her, a solid, unmoving wall against the immense and whispering darkness. That image, more than the warmth of the flames or the wool of the blanket, allowed her to finally slip into a deeper, dreamless sleep. She awoke to the cold. The fire had been reduced to a pile of pale, gray ash, and the pre-dawn air had a crystalline bite that seeped through the blanket and the thin silk of her dress. The eastern sky was a faint smear of lavender and rose, and the stars were beginning to fade. Her first thought was of him. She turned her head, expecting to see him gone, to find the campsite empty save for her and the cooling ashes, a fleeting dream of safety. But he was there. He was no longer on guard, but was crouched by the fire pit, coaxing a new flame to life from the embers with a patient, practiced hand. A small twig caught, then another, and a tiny, welcome flower of orange light bloomed in the gray twilight. He had not abandoned her. A feeling she couldn't name, a fragile, tentative thing fluttered in her chest. It felt dangerously like relief. He seemed to sense her stirring and looked over his shoulder. His face was grim in the half-light, his jaw covered in a dark stubble that made him look both older and more rugged. "Morning," he grunted, the word a cloud of white in the cold air. He turned back to the fire, adding larger pieces of wood until it crackled with renewed life. Clara sat up, pulling the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Every muscle in her body ached in protest. She felt a mess, her hair a tangled mat, her face caked with dust and dried tears. The ruined wedding dress a constant, humiliating reminder of her state. She was a stray dog, taken in for a night, and now that morning was here. She would be expected to move on. The thought brought a fresh wave of despair. Where would she go? What would she do? He took a small, blackened pot and filled it with water from his canteen, setting it on a flat rock at the edge of the flames. Soon, the rich, bitter aroma of coffee began to fill the air. It was a civilized smell in a profoundly uncivilized place, and it made her throat ache with a sudden, sharp longing for a life she had never truly had, but had always dreamed of, a life of simple, quiet mornings, of shared warmth and small comforts. He poured the steaming liquid into 2 tin cups. He drank from one, then pushed the other toward her across the sand. A silent offering. She accepted it, her cold fingers wrapping gratefully around the hot metal. The coffee was strong and black, without sugar or cream, but it was hot, and it chased some of the chill from her bones. They drank in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the rising song of the desert wind. She watched him over the rim of her cup. He seemed utterly self-sufficient, a man who needed nothing and no one. He moved with a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly how to survive in a world that would kill a lesser man in a day. He had shown her a kindness she still couldn't comprehend, and yet he was a complete enigma. He was a locked door, and she had no key. His charity, she feared, had a limit, and she had likely already reached it. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. He looked at her, his gaze direct and assessing. "You're hurt," he stated. It wasn't a question. Clara followed his gaze down to her feet. She had forgotten. The fine, silk slippers she had fled in were long since destroyed. She had been walking in the tattered remains of her lady's boots, and her feet were a mess of blisters and cuts, raw and inflamed. The hem of her dress was stained with small, dark spots of dried blood. "It's nothing," she said, her voice hoarse. She tried to tuck her feet under the rags of her skirt, embarrassed by the exposure, by the evidence of her weakness. His gaze was unwavering. "It's not nothing. In this country, a bad foot can kill you faster than a bullet." He rose and went to one of his saddlebags, rummaging inside. He came back with a small jar of dark salve and a strip of clean linen. He knelt in front of her. Panic seized her. "No," she said, her voice sharp, instinctively recoiling. "I can manage." He stopped, his hands hovering in the air. He didn't look angry, only tired. "Miss, you can either let me tend to it, or you can watch it fester until you can't walk at all. Your choice, but we need to be moving before the sun gets high." His logic was brutal and undeniable. To refuse was petulant, foolish. She was at his mercy, and her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. With a sense of profound defeat, she gave a stiff, miserable nod. His touch, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. He took her foot in his large, calloused hand, his grip firm but not painful. He handled her as if she were a skittish foal, with a quiet, careful competence. He cleaned the cuts with water from his canteen, his movements economical and precise. He didn't say a word, his focus entirely on the task. Clara sat rigidly, her entire body tensed for a sign of something more. A lingering touch, a suggestive look, but there was nothing. He was as detached as a doctor, his expression revealing nothing but concentration. The salve was cool on her raw skin, instantly soothing. He wrapped her feet in the clean linen, his work neat and efficient. When he was done, he released her and stood up without a word, returning the supplies to his saddlebag. She stared at her bandaged feet. He had touched her with an intimacy that no man ever had, and yet it had been utterly impersonal. It was this contradiction that was unraveling her. This man defied every category she had for men. He was not a brute, but he was not a gentleman. He was something else entirely, something wild and self-contained, and she did not know how to read him. The kindness, the sheer practicality of it, was what broke her. It was not pity. It was something far more unnerving. It was respect. He was treating her not as a woman to be coddled or conquered, but as a fellow survivor. And her injuries were a practical problem to be solved. And in that moment, she felt a desperate, overwhelming need for him to understand that she was more than just a problem he had found on the trail. She was not just a victim. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, ragged sound. She clapped a hand over her mouth, horrified. She had not cried when her horse had fallen. She had not cried when she thought she would die of thirst. But this simple, impersonal act of care had shattered her control. He turned, his expression guarded. The tears she had held back for days began to fall, hot and fast, carving clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I am not weak," she choked out, the words tumbling over each other in a rush of emotion that had been dammed up for too long. The dam had broken. He said nothing, just watched her, his face a stony mask. His silence was a challenge. She wiped furiously at her tears with the back of her hand, her chin lifting in defiance. She had to make him see. "You look at me," she began, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "And you see this dress, these cuts. You see a girl running away, and you think you know my story." She took a shaky breath, the words pouring out now. "You were right. Last night, I have never been with a man." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, but his expression remained unchanged. He was waiting. "But it is not because I am afraid," she insisted, her voice rising with passion. "And it is not because I am some fragile, untouched flower to be protected. It is because it was the only thing that was truly mine. My father owned the land, the house. He thought he owned me. He tried to sell me to a man who would own me, too. My body was to be part of the bargain, a piece of property to be handed over. But I refused. This was my choice, my decision. It is not an absence of experience. It is an act of will." She looked him straight in the eye, the tears forgotten, her own words filling her with a fierce, unexpected strength. "I am a virgin, yes, but I am not a girl who has been kept. I am a woman who has kept herself." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and absolute. She had laid her soul bare before this stranger, offered up her most fiercely guarded truth as both a shield and a plea. She had told him everything without telling him anything at all. Wade looked at her. The silence stretched, long and profound. He did not look away. His gaze was no longer just curious or assessing. It was deeper, more intense. He seemed to be looking past the dirt and the torn dress, past the tears and the defiance, and into the very core of her. She felt stripped bare, more exposed than if she had been standing before him with no clothes at all. She felt an overwhelming urge to look away, to hide, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, to stand by the truth she had just declared. He saw the fear in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw the steel that had brought her this far. He saw the pride that had been forged in a crucible of quiet rebellion. He saw a woman who had been offered only cages and had chosen the terrifying freedom of the wilderness instead. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he spoke. His voice was low, softer than she had ever heard it, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Then you have every right to be proud of that," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He let the validation settle over her. A balm on a wound she hadn't known was so raw, but he wasn't finished. A ghost of a smile, the first she had seen, touched the corner of his mouth. It did not mock her. It understood. "But someday," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "if you find yourself walking toward a man not because you're running from another, but because it's your own damn choice, because you want to clear down to your bones, and you give him what you've kept so well." He paused, holding her captive with his gaze. "You'll be prouder still." The world seemed to stop. The fire, the wind, the vast emptiness of the desert, it all faded away, leaving only the two of them in the space his words had created. He had not just heard her, he had understood her on a level she had not thought possible. He hadn't seen her choice as an ending, a treasure to be guarded until it was taken. He had seen it as a beginning, as a source of a power she had yet to wield. He was talking about a future she had never dared to imagine, one where her choice was not about defiance, but about desire. A hot, furious blush spread from her neck all the way to the roots of her hair. It was a blush of shock, of embarrassment, but also of a sudden, startling awareness. She was intensely aware of him, of his size, of the quiet strength that radiated from him, of the way his eyes seemed to see right through her. She broke their gaze first, turning her head away to stare into the fire, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She did not see the look on his face, the flicker of profound respect, mixed with something else, something warmer and more complicated, that softened the hard lines around his eyes. He stood up, the moment broken. "Finish your coffee," he said, his voice back to its usual gruff tone. "We burn daylight." But it was too late. Something fundamental had shifted between them. The invisible wall he had erected the night before was gone, and the silence that fell as they prepared to leave was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, tense and wary. It was a new silence, filled with the weight of her confession and the echo of his startling, intimate words. When he handed her the reins of his horse, gesturing for her to mount while he walked, his fingers brushed hers, and this time, she did not pull away. The way they looked at each other, in quick, stolen glances as the sun climbed higher in the sky, had changed forever. It was no longer the look of a rescuer and a victim, but of a man and a woman who had, against all odds, just seen a glimpse of each other's souls. The sun climbed, a merciless eye in a bleached white sky. It baked the silence between them into something solid and shimmering. Clara rode Wade's horse, a tall, black gelding named Shadow that moved with a steady, ground-eating gait. She sat astride, a position she'd never been allowed to use before, and the unaccustomed posture made her muscles ache. But it was a good ache, a real ache, a welcome distraction from the turmoil in her mind. The tatters of her wedding dress were tucked around her legs as best they could be, a constant, flimsy reminder of her former life. Wade walked ahead, leading the horse by a rope. He moved with a tireless, rhythmic stride that seemed to draw energy from the very earth he crossed. He never seemed to tire, never seemed to falter. He was a part of this harsh landscape, while she was merely a passenger being carried through it. She watched the muscles in his back shift and bunch beneath his dusty shirt, the easy way he carried the rifle in the crook of his arm. After their conversation that morning, she no longer saw him as just a potential threat or a reluctant savior. She saw him as a man who had looked at the most vulnerable part of her and had not seen weakness, but a strange kind of strength. His words from the morning echoed in her head, a persistent, unsettling warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. "You'll be prouder still." The landscape they moved through was vast and brutal. Great mesas rose in the distance, their flat tops scraping the sky. The ground was a patchwork of sand, rock, and skeletal-looking brush that offered no shade. The world felt empty, scoured clean of life. Yet Clara knew it was not. Her flight had taught her that emptiness was an illusion. Dangers hid in plain sight, a rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a rock, a ravine hidden by a rise in the land, a lack of water where you expected to find it. And men, the most dangerous predators of all. She found herself constantly scanning the horizon behind them, her heart giving a painful lurch every time she saw a dust devil swirl into the air. She would stare until her eyes watered, her hands gripping the saddle horn, until the dust dissipated into nothing. She was a hunted animal, and the feeling was a constant, low-grade fever in her blood. She had escaped the cage, but the hunters were still on her trail. Wade never looked back. His attention was always forward, his gaze sweeping the terrain ahead of them, reading the subtle signs of the land, the track of a lizard, the way the wind bent the sparse grass, the distant shimmer of heat that might mean water or a cruel mirage. He seemed to feel her anxiety, though the silence, which had been comfortable after their morning coffee, began to feel heavy again, filled with the things she had not said. He knew a piece of her story, but he didn't know the most important part. The danger wasn't just behind her. It was coming for her, and by helping her, he was walking right into its path. Guilt gnawed at her. This man had saved her life, had treated her with a respect she had never known, and in return, she was leading a wolf pack to his door. He had a right to know the risk he was taking. He had a right to tell her to go on alone, to save himself from a fight that was not his. The thought of being left alone again was terrifying, but the thought of his death being on her conscience was worse. They stopped in the meager shade of a rocky overhang as the sun reached its zenith. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. Wade gave her the canteen first, his eyes watching her face as she drank. He seemed to notice everything, the way her hands trembled, the dark circles under her eyes, the nervous tick at the corner of her mouth. He took the canteen back and drank himself, a long, slow swallow. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said, his voice low and even. "Time you told me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. The time for half-truths and evasions was over. Clara's throat went dry. She looked down at her bandaged feet, then back up at his steady, waiting eyes. "Told you what," she whispered, though she knew perfectly well. "Who you're running from," he clarified, his voice flat. "And who's doing the chasing? I don't like walking into a storm I can't see coming." She took a deep, shuddering breath. This was it. This was the moment he would leave her. She owed him the truth, no matter the cost. "My father," she began, her voice barely audible over the wind. He owns a small ranch a few days east of here. Or he did. The drought of the last 2 years has all but ruined him. He owes money, a great deal of money." She paused, gathering her courage. Wade remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He simply waited, a rock she could either cling to or be dashed against. "The man he owes," she continued, the name tasting like ash in her mouth, "is a Mr. Alistair Finch. He is a man who collects things, land, cattle, artifacts, people. He saw me once, when he came to our home to discuss my father's debts. He looked at me the way he looked at my mother's china cabinet, as something to be acquired, polished, and put on display." She could feel the phantom touch of Finch's gaze on her skin even now, cold and possessive. "He is not a young man. He is older than my father. His hands are soft, and he smells of stale cigars and money. He told my father he would forgive the entire debt, in exchange for my hand in marriage." She saw a muscle tighten in Wade's jaw, the only sign that he was even listening. "My father agreed," she said, the shame of it a fresh wound. "He called it a blessing, a way to save our family. He didn't see the look in Mr. Finch's eyes. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. To him, It was a business transaction, a daughter for a ranch. "So you ran," Wade stated, his voice still flat. "The night before the wedding," she confirmed, her voice cracking. "I took the horse they had given me as a wedding gift. I took this dress because it was the only fine thing I owned that I thought I could trade for passage somewhere. Anywhere else. I was foolish. I had no plan. Only to ride west until I was free." She gave a short, bitter laugh. I did not understand how big the west was, or how empty. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the vast, empty horizon as if he could see her desperate journey laid out upon it. He then brought his gaze back to her, and it was sharper now, harder. "That's the man you're running from," he said. "Now tell me who's chasing you." This was the hardest part. This was the part that implicated him. "Mr. Finch does not like to lose his possessions," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And my father cannot afford to lose his forgiveness of the debt. They sent men, 3 of them." Wade's posture changed. It was a subtle shift, but she saw it. He straightened his back, his shoulders squaring. He was no longer just a man resting in the shade. He was a man listening for the first rumbles of thunder. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice clipped and hard. "The foreman from my father's ranch, a man named Jebediah." She said, the name of a man she had known since she was a child, now feeling like a curse. He is a hard man, but he has always been loyal to my father. He is a good tracker. The other 2 are hands from Mr. Finch's estate. I don't know their names. I only saw them once. They have the look of men who are paid to do things others will not, men who enjoy their work. She had said it all. The whole, ugly truth was laid bare between them in the oppressive heat. She watched his face, searching for any sign of what he was thinking. Would she see anger, annoyance, fear? Would he tell her she was a fool, that she had brought this on herself, that he was washing his hands of her? She braced for the impact of his rejection. Wade said nothing. For a full, agonizing minute, he was absolutely still, his gaze fixed on some point far out in the desert. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the trouble she had described, giving it shape and form in his mind. He was weighing the odds 1 man against 3, 1 rifle against 3, a tired horse carrying double the load it should, and a girl who was more liability than asset. The calculation was simple, the outcome obvious. He would leave her. He had to. It was the only logical thing to do. She watched as he slowly pushed himself to his feet. He walked over to Shadow, who stood patiently with his head drooping in the heat. He didn't look at Clara. His movements were deliberate, economical. He ran a hand down the horse's leg, checking for any sign of injury. He lifted the saddle blanket to let the air at the horse's sweaty back. He checked the straps of the saddle, pulling one a notch tighter. Every action was small, practical, and utterly mundane, and every action was a nail in the coffin of her hope. He was preparing to leave. He moved to his saddlebags and took out his rifle. He broke it down with the same fluid efficiency as he had the night before, checking the mechanism, wiping away a fine layer of dust she hadn't even noticed. He was a man preparing for a journey, a solo journey. Clara's heart sank into the pit of her stomach. A cold dread, worse than any she had felt while lost and alone, began to creep through her. She had been a fool to hope, a fool to think this stranger's kindness extended to risking his life for her. She should get up. She should thank him for his help and start walking. She should die with at least a shred of her dignity intact. But she couldn't move. She could only watch as he methodically destroyed her last, fragile chance of survival. He finished with the rifle and reassembled it. He took a small leather pouch from his belt and carefully counted the cartridges inside, his lips moving silently. He seemed satisfied. He slotted the rifle back into its scabbard on the saddle. Then he stopped. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked, his body taut as a bowstring. He was looking east, back the way they had come. "What is it?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He raised a hand, gesturing for her to be silent. She held her breath, straining her ears, but she could hear nothing but the ceaseless, lonely cry of the wind. He stood like that for a long time, a statue of pure, focused attention. Then he slowly crouched down, his eyes narrowed to slits, still staring east. Clara followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze rising from the desert floor. It distorted the horizon, making the distant mesas tremble. It was a landscape of illusions. But then she saw it. It was tiny, indistinct, a faint disturbance on the farthest edge of the visible world. It was a smudge of brown against the pale blue of the sky. It could have been anything, a trick of the light, a gust of wind kicking up the dust. But it was not dissipating. It was growing, ever so slightly. It was a plume of dust, rising steadily. And it was moving. It was moving toward them. A cold fist of terror closed around Clara's heart. Is it? Maybe. Wade cut her off, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Maybe it's just wind, but the wind doesn't ride in a straight line. He watched the dust cloud for another moment, his face grim. The decision was made. The time for calculation was over. He turned to her, and his eyes were like chips of ice. The detached stranger was gone. The quiet, respectful man from that morning was gone. In his place was someone else, someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. This was the man who had survived out here alone. This was the man who knew how to kill. He didn't speak of the danger, or of her, or of the odds. He spoke only of what must be done. "We need to be out of this open ground before sundown," he said, his voice sharp with an authority that demanded absolute obedience. "There's a series of canyons about 5 miles north of here. If we can make it there, we'll have cover. We move now." He strode over to her, and for the first time, he reached for her without hesitation. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her to her feet. "Up," he commanded, gesturing to the horse, "and ride like the devil himself is chasing you, because he just might be." There was no more thought, only the jarring, brutal rhythm of the horse's gallop. The world became a blur of red rock and bleached sky. The wind a physical force that tore the breath from Clara's lips and whipped tears from her eyes. She clung to the saddle horn, her body a dead weight, her mind a numb void of terror. The distant plume of dust was a relentless demon on their heels, a promise of the violence she had fled, now given form and speed. Wade was no longer leading the horse. He ran beside it, one hand gripping the leather of the saddle, his long legs eating up the treacherous ground. He was a force of nature in himself, his face a mask of grim determination, his eyes fixed on a point in the distant, shimmering wall of rock that marked the edge of the Badlands. He didn't speak, only urged the horse on with a low, guttural sound, pushing the animal and himself to the very brink of their endurance. The open desert was a killing floor, offering no cover, no place to hide. Every second they spent exposed felt like a lifetime under the gun sights of the men behind them. Clara risked a glance over her shoulder. The dust cloud was larger now, no longer a smudge but a definite, churning column. She could not make out riders. Not yet, but she didn't need to. She could feel them. Their presence was a pressure at her back, a cold certainty that shortened her breath. Just as she felt the horse's powerful stride begin to falter, the ground changed. The flat, sandy plain gave way to a broken, jagged landscape of stone and gravel. They were climbing now, scrambling up a long, alluvial fan at the base of the cliffs. The horse's hooves sent stones skittering down the slope, the sound painfully loud in the sudden stillness. Wade slowed the animal to a walk, his own chest heaving, sweat plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He led them not toward the sheer face of the cliffs, but to a place where the rock had fractured and collapsed in on itself eons ago. It looked like a dead end, a chaotic jumble of massive, house-sized boulders. But Wade did not hesitate. He guided the horse through a narrow, almost invisible gap between two towering slabs of red sandstone. The transition was instantaneous and profound. One moment they were in the blinding, open glare of the sun. The next they were plunged into deep, cool shadow. The temperature dropped by 20 degrees. The roar of the wind was gone, replaced by an echoing silence that was broken only by the horse's ragged breathing and the drip of water from an unseen spring high above. They were in a slot canyon, a narrow fissure carved into the heart of the rock by millennia of flash floods. The walls were smooth and sculpted, rising 100 feet on either side, so close together that Clara felt she could reach out and touch both sides at once. The sky was reduced to a thin, brilliant blue ribbon far above. Nature, which had been their tormentor on the open plain, now became their savior. The canyon twisted and turned, a natural labyrinth that would hide them, swallow their trail, and protect them from the prying eyes of their pursuers. Wade led them deeper into the earth's embrace, his steps sure and certain. He knew this place. This was not a desperate, random flight. It was a calculated retreat to a place of strength. After a quarter-mile of winding through the narrow passage, he stopped. To their right, hidden behind a curtain of ancient, hardy vines and a recent rockfall, was a dark opening, a cave. It was not large, little more than a deep hollow carved into the base of the canyon wall, but it was dry and completely concealed from the main passage. "In here," Wade commanded, his voice a low rasp. He helped her slide down from the horse, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist. For a moment, her legs refused to hold her, and she swayed against him, her body utterly spent. He held her steady for a beat, his strength a solid wall she could lean against, before gently guiding her toward the cave entrance. He tied the horse's reins to a hardy shrub growing from a crack in the rock, where it was hidden from view and could nibble on the sparse greenery. The cave was dark and smelled of cool stone and damp earth. As her eyes adjusted, Clara could see that it was just deep enough for them to take shelter. Wade leaned his rifle against the wall near the entrance and sank down, his back against the rock, his gaze fixed on the narrow slice of canyon visible from their hiding place. He was not resting. He was watching, listening, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. The adrenaline that had sustained Clara through the frantic ride drained away all at once, leaving behind an exhaustion so complete it was a physical agony. Her bones felt like they were dissolving, her muscles trembling with fatigue. She slid down the wall opposite him, her legs folding beneath her. The last few days crashed down on her, the flight, the thirst, the fear, the desperate hope. And now this frantic, heart-pounding chase. It was too much. She watched him, his profile carved out of the dim light. He was utterly focused, his attention directed outward, toward the danger. He had not said a word about her confession, about the trouble she had brought down upon him. He had simply acted, placing his own life in the path of her pursuers without a moment's hesitation. He was a stranger, yet he was protecting her as if she were his own. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The dark, cool cave seemed to tilt and sway. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, to steady herself. She leaned her head back against the rough stone wall, but it offered no comfort. Without thinking, drawn by the primal need for warmth and solidness, she shifted, inching across the sandy floor until she was beside him. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a bold, intimate gesture she would never have dared to make just that morning, but she was too tired to consider the implications. His shoulder was solid, real, a bastion against the chaos. He tensed for a moment at the contact, a rigid line of surprise. Then, so subtly she almost didn't feel it, he relaxed, accepting her presence, her silent surrender to exhaustion. Her last conscious thought was of the steady, reassuring rhythm of his breathing. Then, the darkness of the cave merged with the darkness of sleep, and she fell away into nothingness. She dreamed of running, of the thunder of hooves behind her, of Mr. Finch's cold, grasping hands, of falling into an endless, dark canyon. She awoke with a soft gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she was disoriented. The cave was much darker now. The ribbon of sky visible through the entrance was no longer blue, but a deep, bruised purple of twilight. She was cold, a deep, penetrating chill that had settled into her bones. She was covered with something heavy, something that smelled of leather, dust, and him. Wade's jacket. He was still there, sitting beside her, exactly as he had been when she'd fallen asleep. He was a statue of vigilance, the rifle laid across his lap now, his gaze still fixed on the canyon entrance. He had not moved, had not slept. He had been watching over her this whole time. As she watched, a slight shiver ran through her, a product of the cold and the lingering fear of her dream. He must have felt the small movement. Without taking his eyes off the entrance, he reached over with one hand and gently, almost absently, adjusted the jacket, pulling it higher up around her shoulders to better shield her from the cold. It was a small, unconscious gesture of care, delivered by a man who was otherwise consumed by the deadly seriousness of their situation. And it was that small gesture that broke through the last of her reserves. He was thinking of her comfort, even now, when his own life was on the line. The truth of her situation washed over her. She was a burden. She was physically spent, emotionally fragile, a liability in every conceivable way. She had no skills for this life, no strength for this country. He had to know it. He had seen her collapse, had seen her cry, had seen her give in to the exhaustion that he himself had fought off. He knew exactly how weak she was. A whisper escaped her lips, so quiet it was nearly lost in the vast silence of the canyon. You knew. She breathed, her voice thick with sleep and a dawning, painful understanding. You saw how weak I was, and you saved me anyway. It was an admission of her own inadequacy, a question and a statement of wonder all in one. Why would a man like him, a man so clearly strong and self-sufficient, risk himself for someone so obviously helpless? For a long moment, Wade didn't answer. He remained still, his gaze fixed on the deepening shadows outside. She thought perhaps he hadn't heard her, that her words had been too quiet. But then, he turned his head, and in the deep twilight of the cave, his eyes found hers. They were not filled with pity, or annoyance, or regret. They held a steady, unwavering light that seemed to see past the tattered dress and the exhausted woman, and into the person she had declared herself to be that morning. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, but it was completely devoid of the hardness it had held during the chase. It was a voice that held the quiet certainty of a fundamental truth. I didn't see a weak woman back there. Clara, he said, the sound of her name on his lips for the first time both startling and strangely intimate. He paused, letting his gaze hold hers, ensuring she understood the weight of what he was about to say. I saw the one who keeps herself, and that's a woman worth fighting for. Wade's words in the cave had become a shield for Clara, a secret warmth she held against the biting winds and the gnawing fear of the following days. They traveled hard and fast, moving mostly at dawn and dusk, resting during the highest heat of the day in whatever sliver of shade they could find. They spoke little. Words were a luxury they could not afford. All their energy was poured into the simple, brutal act of survival. Wade taught her to read the subtle language of the land, to find water where none seemed to exist, to recognize the tracks of animals, and, most importantly, to erase their own. He moved with a hunter's grace, a phantom in the landscape, and she did her best to emulate him, learning to step lightly, to use the terrain for cover, to become a shadow alongside his. The men who pursued them were relentless. She knew, but Wade was smarter. He led them on a confounding, circuitous route through the Badlands, a path designed to break a trail and then vanish, leaving their hunters to guess at which direction they had taken. Twice, from a high ridge, they saw the distant figures of 3 riders, tiny specks moving across the vast expanse below. and both times Wade had led them away, down into a dry wash or through a field of shattered rock, until the threat was once again a memory. The constant tension wore on her, but something within her was hardening, sloughing off the soft, useless skin of her former life. The desert was a harsh teacher, but a thorough one. She was no longer the terrified girl who had collapsed at Wade's fire. She was a lean, sun-darkened woman who knew the weight of a canteen and the true, life-giving value of a handful of scavenged piñon nuts. On the fourth day after the chase, a cold, persistent rain began to fall, turning the dust to a slick, red mud that clung to their boots and made the horse miserable. They were exposed, cold, and utterly wretched. It was as they rounded the base of a low, pine-studded mesa that they saw it, tucked into a grove of aspen trees. So weathered and gray, it seemed a part of the landscape itself, stood a small, dilapidated cabin. It was an impossible, miraculous sight, a ghost of civilization in the heart of the wilderness. Smoke did not rise from its stone chimney, and one of the shutters hung crookedly from a single leather hinge. But it had 4 walls and a roof, a promise of shelter that was more beautiful to Clara than any grand house she had ever seen. Wade approached it with caution, his rifle held ready. He circled the small structure, his eyes scanning for any sign of recent occupation. Finding none, he pushed open the heavy plank door, which groaned in protest. He disappeared inside for a long moment before re-emerging, giving her a single, sharp nod. It was safe. Inside, the cabin was a single, dusty room. A rough-hewn table and a single 3-legged stool were the only furniture. A stone hearth, black with the soot of 1,000 long-dead fires, dominated one wall. Cobwebs laced the corners, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood, dust, and abandonment. But it was dry. It was shelter. To Clara, it felt like a palace. While Wade tended to the horse, rubbing the weary animal down and tethering it in the meager shelter of the trees, Clara felt a sudden, powerful urge to contribute, to do something more than simply be protected. The hearth called to her. A fire would mean warmth, a way to dry their sodden clothes. A hot meal. It would mean turning this derelict shelter into a temporary home. It would be her offering. A way to prove that the woman he'd saved was not entirely useless. She found a stack of dry wood left by the cabin's last occupant. A small blessing. She carefully arranged the kindling in the hearth, just as she had seen her family's cook do 100 times. She laid the larger pieces on top, creating a small, hopeful structure. The final, most crucial part was the spark. She found a flint and steel on the mantelpiece, rusted but serviceable. She knelt before the hearth, her heart filled with a determined, almost desperate resolve. She would do this. She struck the steel against the flint. A few weak, pathetic sparks flew, dying instantly in the damp air. She tried again, her movements more forceful. Nothing. She adjusted the tinder, shredding the dry bark into finer pieces, positioning it just so. She struck again and again, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt. Her hands grew clumsy, her movements frantic. The flint slipped, striking her knuckle, and she let out a small, sharp cry of pain and anger. It was a stupid, simple task, and she could not do it. The fire, which had seemed such a potent symbol of hope, was now a monument to her own inadequacy. She slumped back on her heels in defeat, staring at the useless pile of wood, a familiar, cold despair seeping into her bones. All her progress, all the hardening of the last few days, felt like a sham. In the end, she was still the same girl, unable to perform the most basic act of survival. She didn't hear him enter the cabin. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell over her. She didn't look up, too ashamed to meet his gaze. "It's damp," Wade said, his voice a low rumble. It held no judgment, no mockery, only a simple statement of fact. The tinder needs to be finer, and you have to strike down, with force, right into the heart of it. She still didn't look at him. "I can't," she whispered, the words thick with failure. She expected him to sigh, to take the tools from her and light the fire himself with that effortless competence he brought to everything. She expected him to prove, once again, how much she needed him. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. Then, she heard him move. He didn't move in front of her to take over. He moved behind her. He knelt down, his body a solid, warm presence at her back. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the scent of rain and pine on his clothes. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice quiet, right beside her ear. "You just need to be shown how. Give me your hands." Hesitantly, as if in a dream, she held up her hands, the flint and steel still clutched within them. He didn't just take them. He settled in behind her, his long legs bracketing her, his chest a solid wall against her back. Then, he reached around and covered her hands with his own. The shock of it was a jolt, more powerful than any spark she had managed to create. His hands were huge, completely enveloping hers. They were rough and calloused, scarred from a life of hard work and harder fights. Yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. He did not take control. He simply enfolded her, making her hands and his a single unit. It was the most intimate contact they had ever shared, a touch that was both practical and profoundly personal. "All right now," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "Watch." He guided her hand, the one holding the steel. He moved it slowly, deliberately, showing her the proper angle. "Keep your wrist firm." Then he adjusted her other hand, positioning the flint. "Hold it steady, right here." He guided her through the motion, a slow, deliberate strike downward. A shower of bright, hot sparks cascaded directly into the fine, fluffy center of the tinder. A tiny, ember-red glow appeared, a single point of light in the gloom. "Now," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Don't stop, again." He guided her hand again, and then again. More sparks flew, feeding the growing ember. A thin, hopeful curl of smoke began to rise. "Now, lean in, gently. Blow on it." She obeyed, leaning forward, his body moving with hers. He was still holding her hands, his arms a cage of warmth around her. She blew a soft, steady stream of air onto the ember. It glowed brighter, from red to a brilliant, pulsing orange. The smoke thickened. She blew again, and with a sudden, magical whoosh, a tiny, bright yellow flame erupted from the tinder, licking at the kindling above it. It was alive. The flame grew, catching on the larger twigs, its light dancing and flickering, pushing back the shadows in the cabin. It threw their faces into sharp, warm relief, a world of orange and gold. The light reflected in his eyes, turning them the color of warm whiskey. It was only then that Clara became aware of just how close he was. In the focused intensity of their shared task, she had forgotten everything else. But now, in the sudden bloom of light, she saw her back was pressed firmly against his chest. His arms were still around her, his hands still covering hers. She had only to turn her head slightly to find his face was mere inches from her own. She slowly lifted her gaze from the new fire to him. He was already looking at her, his expression one she had never seen before. It was not guarded or assessing. It was open, quiet, and intense. The firelight carved new lines and shadows on his face, softening the hardness, revealing a vulnerability she had never suspected was there. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of the flame, and something more, a deep, patient heat that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. The air grew thick, heavy. The world seemed to narrow to the few inches of space between them. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back. Her own heart was a wild, frantic thing. A tremor started in her hands, a fine, uncontrollable shaking. "I'm trembling," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. She didn't know if she was explaining the shaking of her hands or confessing a deeper truth. He looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice a low thrum that vibrated through her. She considered the question. Was she afraid? Yes, but not of him, not anymore. She was afraid of this feeling, this terrifying, exhilarating pull toward him. She was afraid of the part of herself that wanted to lean back into his strength, that wanted to turn in his arms, that wanted to close the final, infinitesimal distance between them. She was afraid of the hope he had ignited in her, a hope as fragile and as new as the flame in the hearth. "No," she breathed, meeting his gaze, forcing herself to speak the most honest words of her life. "I'm trembling because I want to trust you." It was a confession of immense vulnerability, an admission that the walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crumble. She saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of profound understanding, of a deep, resonant emotion that mirrored her own. For a breathtaking moment, she thought he would lean in, that he would close that final distance. Instead, he did the exact opposite. With a control that was both astonishing and heartbreakingly tender, he slowly, deliberately, released her hands. He drew his arms back and shifted away, moving with a fluid grace until he was standing a full step back from her. He broke the contact, shattered the spell, and gave her back the space she had not even realized she had surrendered. He stood before her, the firelight playing over his tall frame. He slowly raised one hand, not to reach for her, but to place it flat against the center of his own chest, over his heart. It was a gesture of immense sincerity, a silent oath. "Then I'll stand still," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, a vow spoken into the warm, fire-lit air of the cabin. "Until you stop trembling." Wade's promise hung in the air between them, more real and more solid than the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. He stood still, his hand over his heart, a sentinel of his own word. The fire crackled, filling the silence with its cheerful, domestic sound, a sound that felt alien and yet deeply, achingly welcome. Clara, still kneeling on the hearth, felt the trembling in her hands slowly subside, not because the fear was gone, but because his stillness had become her anchor. She finally found the strength to look away from his intense gaze and back to the fire she had created with his help. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, the air warm and tasting of wood smoke. When she looked up again, he had moved. He hadn't left, but had simply turned to the pack he'd carried in, creating a bit of distance, a quiet acknowledgement that the moment of high tension had passed and a new, more uncertain territory had begun. The cabin, which had at first seemed a wretched and derelict shelter, began to transform under the influence of the firelight. The flickering orange glow softened the hard edges of the room, turning the dusty, forgotten space into a haven. The persistent rain outside, which had been a miserable torment, now became a gentle, rhythmic drumming on the roof, a soothing sound that insulated them from the vast, hostile world. They were in a bubble of warmth and light, a temporary island in a sea of cold and darkness. A new kind of awkwardness settled between them. The clearly defined roles of protector and protected, of rescuer and survivor, had dissolved in the heat of her confession and his vow. Now, they were simply a man and a woman, alone in a room, with a universe of unspoken things hanging in the air. It was hunger that finally broke the spell. A low grumble from Clara's stomach cut through the quiet, a sound so mundane it was almost comical. She flushed, embarrassed, but Wade simply turned from his pack, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Sounds like that fire is asking for something to cook," he said, his voice returning to its familiar, practical tone. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. It was the rest of the rabbit from the night before, along with a few wizened potatoes and a single, sad-looking onion he must have been hoarding. To Clara, it looked like a feast. "I can," she began, moving to take the food from him, ready to fall back into the familiar role of a woman preparing a meal. "We can," he corrected her gently, stopping her with a look. He handed her the onion and his long, sharp knife. "You handle that. I'll see to the rest." And so they began to cook their first meal together. It was an unspoken, unpracticed dance in the small, fire-lit space. Clara sat on the three-legged stool, carefully peeling and chopping the onion, the sharp smell bringing tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with sorrow. Wade jointed the rabbit with an efficiency that was both brutal and graceful, then filled the small pot with water from his canteen and set it to boil over the flames. They moved around each other, a strange and quiet choreography developing between them. When he needed the knife, he simply held out his hand, and she placed it in his palm, their fingers brushing for a fleeting, electric moment. When she finished with the onion, he was there with the pot, and she scraped the pieces in. He added the potatoes and the meat, and soon a rich, savory aroma began to fill the cabin, a smell of home, of life. It was the most normal thing she had done in what felt like an eternity, and yet it was utterly extraordinary. This simple act of preparing food together was a form of communication more profound than any words they had yet shared. It was a partnership. It was a quiet declaration that, for this one night, they were not just two strangers thrown together by fate, but a unit, working together against the hunger and the cold. When the stew was ready, they ate in a comfortable silence, sitting on the floor before the fire, sharing the 2 tin plates and a single spoon. The stew was simple, but it was hot and nourishing, and to Clara, it tasted of safety. The warmth of the food spread through her, a deep and calming heat that settled not just in her belly, but in her soul. After they had eaten, and the plates were cleaned and put away, a deep sense of peace settled over the small cabin. The rain still drummed on the roof, a gentle, lulling rhythm. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, red-orange coals that pulsed with a soft, steady light. Clara sat with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest, the borrowed wool blanket wrapped around her. She was warm. She was dry. And for the first time since she had fled her father's house, she felt safe. Not just physically safe from the men who were hunting her, but safe in a deeper, more fundamental way. Wade sat on the other side of the hearth, leaning back against his saddle, oiling a piece of his horse's tackle. The rhythmic squeak of the leather and the soft hiss of the coals were the only sounds. He seemed completely at ease, a man at peace in his element. But Clara watched him, and she saw the tension that still lingered in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes would occasionally flick toward the door. He was a wolf, ever vigilant, even in a moment of rest, and she was the reason he could not fully rest. The guilt of it was a small, sharp stone in her heart. Perhaps he felt her watching him, or perhaps the silence had stretched on long enough. He set the leather strap aside and looked into the fire. "My pa," he began, his voice a low, unexpected rumble in the quiet room. He used to say that a man who couldn't tell a good story was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. Clara looked at him, surprised. He had never spoken of his family, had never offered any piece of his past. He gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. "Never was much good at it myself, but he told me one I always remembered." He didn't look at her, but stared into the glowing coals, as if the story were written there. "It was about a coyote," he said, his voice taking on a slow, storytelling cadence. "A real scrawny fella, always hungry. One day, he sees the moon, big and round and yellow, reflected in a pond, and he thinks to himself, 'Well now, that there's the biggest wheel of cheese I ever did see.' So he decides he's going to drink the whole pond dry to get to that cheese." Clara found herself leaning forward slightly, captivated by the simple absurdity of the image. "So he starts drinking," Wade continued, a hint of a smile in his voice. "He drinks and he drinks. The water goes down, but the moon, it just stays right where it is. He drinks until he's so full of water he's sloshing when he walks. He's puffed up like a bullfrog. miserable as can be. And he looks down, and there's that big, beautiful cheese, still sitting on the bottom of the pond, laughing at him. He paused, poking at the coals with a stick, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Finally, the sun starts to come up, and as the sky gets light, the moon in the water starts to fade away. The coyote, he just sits there, full of nothing but pond water and disappointment, and he watches his big, beautiful wheel of cheese disappear right before his eyes. He never did get his cheese, just a bellyache. Wade fell silent. The story finished. It was a nonsensical little tale, a piece of foolish folklore with no real point or moral. It was simple and sad and utterly ridiculous. And Clara laughed. It was not a giggle or a polite chuckle. It was a real, true sound that seemed to erupt from the very depths of her. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated delight, a sound of release. All the fear, the tension, the grief, and the exhaustion of the past week seemed to be caught up in that sound and expelled in a rush of sheer, bubbling joy. She laughed until her sides ached, until tears streamed down her face. Tears of mirth this time, not of sorrow. She had forgotten what it felt like to laugh. The sound was a stranger in her own throat, a beautiful, liberating stranger. When her laughter finally subsided into small, breathless gasps, she wiped her eyes and looked over at Wade. He was watching her, and the expression on his face stopped her breath. The stoic mask was gone. In its place was a look of such profound, unguarded tenderness that it made her heart ache. He was looking at her as if her laughter were the most precious and beautiful thing he had ever witnessed, a sound more valuable than gold, more nourishing than water. In that moment, she understood that he hadn't told the story to be clever or profound. He had told it just for this, to hear her laugh. The next morning, the rain had stopped. A clean, washed light filtered through the cabin's single grimy window. Clara awoke to find herself alone. Wade was gone, though his saddle and pack were still there. A deep, primal panic flared in her for a moment before she calmed herself. He wouldn't have left his gear. He was out scouting, or hunting. She was safe. She rose and stretched, feeling the pleasant ache of a body that had finally had a full night's restful sleep. The cabin was cold without the fire, but it was still a shelter. On the small, rough table, she saw her tin water cup. It was filled with fresh, clean water. Beside it was a small bowl he had carved from a piece of wood. It, too, was filled with water for her to wash. It was a simple, thoughtful gesture, and it filled her with a quiet warmth. She took the bowl and was about to step outside when she saw it, floating in the center of the small bowl. Its bright, cheerful face, a startling splash of color against the dark wood, was a single, perfect desert primrose. It was a tiny, delicate thing, a testament to the resilience of life in this harsh land. Its petals were the color of a sunrise, its center a bright, hopeful yellow. It was a thing of impossible, gratuitous beauty. She stared at it, her heart giving a great, painful lurch. He had done this, in the cold, gray light of dawn. Wade, the hard, silent, dangerous man, had gone out and found a wildflower and had placed it in her wash basin. It was a gesture so unexpected, so tender, so completely out of character that it stole her breath. It was a secret message, a silent poem. It said, "I see you. I see the woman beneath the dirt and the fear. I see the part of you that is still capable of appreciating beauty." She carefully lifted the flower from the water, its stem cool and damp against her fingers. She held it as if it were a jewel. All day, as she tidied the small cabin and rekindled the fire, she kept the flower close, tucked into a crack in the wall where she could see it. It was a small, bright spot of color in the gray room, a constant, silent reminder of his gesture. He returned late in the afternoon, 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder. He did not mention the flower. He did not even look at it. He was once again the practical, focused survivor. But Clara saw the way his eyes briefly flickered to her face, a quick, questioning glance. She offered him a small, shy smile, and she saw the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction. That night, after their meal, as Wade slept soundly on his bedroll, his breathing deep and even, Clara took the small primrose from its place in the soft, dying light of the embers. She tiptoed over to where he lay. She looked down at his face, so harsh and guarded in wakefulness, now softened and peaceful in sleep. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she gently, reverently, placed the small wildflower on the bundled-up jacket that served as his pillow, right beside his head. It was her answer, spoken in the same silent, secret language he had used. It was a gesture that held everything she did not know how to say. No words of love were spoken in the small, dark cabin. None were needed. In the shared meal, in the foolish story, in the sound of her laughter, and in the silent journey of a single, fragile wildflower. Everything had already been said. The fragile peace of the cabin lasted for 2 full days. They were days lived outside of time, a stolen interlude in a world that had, for the moment, forgotten them. The fear of pursuit did not vanish, but it receded, becoming a dull, background hum instead of a sharp, screaming terror. They fell into a quiet rhythm, a domesticity that was both strange and deeply comforting. Wade would hunt and scout, returning with a quiet word and a brace of quail or a piece of firewood. Clara, in turn, transformed the dusty cabin. She swept the floor with a makeshift broom of aspen branches. She washed their few utensils in the stream, and she learned to bank the fire so that the coals would last through the night. They spoke more, their conversations no longer just clipped, practical exchanges, but meandering explorations. He told her of the mountains to the north, of winters so cold your breath would freeze in the air. She told him of the books she had read, of worlds of poetry and history that existed only on paper. They were mapping the unknown territories of each other, discovering a landscape of shared loneliness and a surprising, unspoken understanding. The silent language of the wildflower continued between them in small, almost imperceptible gestures, the way he would leave the fullest canteen for her, the way she would save him the best piece of meat from their meager meals. It was on the evening of the 3rd day that their stolen time ran out. The sun had set, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange. A stew of quail and wild roots bubbled over the fire, filling the small cabin with a rich, comforting aroma. Clara was humming a soft tune, a half-forgotten melody from her childhood. As she stirred the pot, Wade sat by the door, cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical clicks of the metal a soothing, rhythmic counterpoint to her humming. A sense of profound, quiet contentment had settled over her. She felt, for the first time in her life, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first warning was not a sound, but a feeling, a sudden, prickling tension in the air. Wade froze, his hand stilled on the rifle, his head lifted, his gaze fixed on the cabin's single, shuttered window. "What is it?" Clara whispered, her humming cut short. He didn't answer. He held up a hand for silence, his body going taut. He rose in a single, fluid motion, silent as a cat, and moved to the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of returning fear. Outside, Shadow, who had been dozing peacefully in the aspen grove, let out a low, nervous whicker. The sound was followed by a sharp, agitated snort. Wade looked at her, and the quiet man she had come to know was gone. In his place was the dangerous, cold-eyed survivor she had first met. His eyes were chips of flint. "Get away from the fire," he commanded in a harsh whisper. "Get against the back wall, and stay down." Before she could react, the world erupted into chaos. A heavy boot slammed against the cabin door, the wood groaning, the leather hinges straining. Another kick, and the door burst inward with a splintering crash. 3 figures filled the doorway, dark silhouettes against the dying light, their forms monstrous and huge. Clara recognized the heavy, stooped shoulders of Jebediah, her father's foreman. The other 2 were leaner, quicker, their face shadowed and cruel. They were the men from Finch's estate. They had found them. Events unfolded in a series of terrifying, disjointed snapshots. Wade didn't hesitate. He was not a man who waited to be attacked. He launched himself forward, not at the men in the door, but to the side, using the element of surprise. He brought the butt of his rifle up in a vicious arc, catching one of Finch's men squarely in the jaw. There was a sickening crunch, and the man went down with a grunt. But there were 2 more. Jebediah bellowed, a wordless roar of fury, and lunged into the cabin. He was a big man, powerful as an ox, and he swung a heavy, thick club that whistled through the air. Wade ducked under the blow, the club smashing into the table and shattering it into kindling. The second of Finch's men was faster. He pulled a long, gleaming knife and darted past Jebediah, his movements snake-like. He went for Wade's side. Wade twisted, parrying the knife thrust with the barrel of his rifle, the screech of steel on the steel setting Clara's teeth on edge. The fight was a brutal, close-quarters affair, a whirlwind of grunts, curses, and the sickening thud of fists on flesh. Wade was magnificent, a cornered wolf fighting with the fury of a demon. He moved with a speed and economy of motion that was terrifying to behold. He used the rifle as both a club and a shield, keeping the 2 men at bay, trying to maneuver them into a position where he could get a clear shot. Clara was frozen against the back wall, a useless, terrified spectator. Her mind screamed at her to do something, to help, but her body would not obey. She was paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. Then, she saw something that turned her blood to ice. The man Wade had first struck was not unconscious. He was crawling, his face a mask of pain and rage, not toward the fight, but toward the hearth. He grabbed a piece of the shattered table, a long splinter of dry wood, and thrust it deep into the glowing coals of the fire. He pulled it out, the end of it now a blazing, spitting torch. "Burn them out," he shrieked, his voice thick with pain. He scrambled back toward the door and thrust the torch into the dry, weathered wood of the cabin wall. The old, seasoned timber caught instantly. A line of hungry, orange flame began to lick its way up the wall, smoke beginning to billow into the small room. The sight of the flames broke Clara's paralysis. This was their shelter, their haven, and it was being destroyed. But there was no time for grief. The smoke was already thick and acrid, stinging her eyes and catching in her throat. Wade saw it too. He knew they were trapped. With a savage roar, he drove Jebediah back a step with a powerful kick, then spun, bringing his rifle around to bear on the knife-wielding man. But he was a fraction of a second too late. As he turned, Jebediah recovered and charged, his heavy club swinging down. Wade tried to dodge, but the blow caught him high on the left shoulder. It wasn't a clean hit, but the force of it was tremendous. Wade staggered, a sharp cry of pain torn from his lips, and his rifle slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, clattering to the floor. The man with the knife saw his opening. He lunged, the blade flashing in the firelight. Wade, off balance and injured, could only twist away. The knife, instead of sinking into his gut, slashed a deep, bloody furrow across his ribs. Wade grunted, stumbling back, his face pale with shock and pain. He was hurt. He was disarmed, and the 2 men were closing in for the kill. In that instant, something inside Clara snapped. The fear did not vanish, but it was consumed by a hot, white wave of pure, unadulterated rage. They were hurting him. They were trying to kill the man who had shown her kindness, the man who had made her laugh, the man who had vowed to stand still until she stopped trembling. She moved without thinking, her body propelled by an instinct she never knew she possessed. She scrambled across the floor, through the smoke and the chaos, her eyes fixed on the fallen rifle. She snatched it up. It was heavier than she could have imagined. its wooden stock and steel barrel cold and alien in her hands. "Wade," she screamed, her voice a raw, ragged thing. He heard her, bleeding, his left arm hanging useless at his side. He risked a glance at her. His eyes widened in shock, but then a flicker of something else crossed his face, understanding. Trust. With the last of his strength, he shoved the man with the knife hard, sending him stumbling backward. And then he threw himself at Jebediah, tackling the big man around the waist. It was a desperate, suicidal move, designed not to win but to buy her a single, precious second. Clara got to her feet, the rifle clutched in her hands. She did not know how it worked, how to aim, how to fire. She only knew that it was a tool of death, and death was what these men had brought into their home. The man with the knife, having recovered his balance, saw her, his lips peeled back in a predatory sneer. He saw a frightened woman in a tattered dress, holding a weapon she didn't know how to use. He saw an easy victim. He started toward her, the knife held low and ready. "Give me that little girl," he hissed, his eyes filled with a cruel, ugly light. "I'll show you how it's done." He lunged for her. Time seemed to slow down. Clara saw his sneering face, the flash of the blade, the murderous intent in his eyes. She saw Wade and Jebediah grappling on the floor, a tangle of limbs in the smoke and flickering firelight. She smelled the smoke, the sweat, the blood, and she felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over her. She lifted the heavy rifle. Her hands were shaking violently, the barrel waving in an unsteady arc, but her eyes, when she looked down that long, steel barrel, were as steady and as cold as a winter stone. She did not close them. She did not look away. She saw her target. Her finger found the trigger. She pulled. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin, a brutal, concussive roar that slammed into her, making her ears ring. The rifle kicked back with the force of a mule, throwing her off balance and sending a jarring shock up her arms. The butt of the gun smashed into her shoulder, and she cried out, stumbling backward, dropping the weapon. The man who had been lunging at her simply stopped. A look of profound, almost comical surprise crossed his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, as if curious, then looked back up at her. The sneer was gone, replaced by a blank, empty stare. He took one step, then another, his legs folding beneath him as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He fell to the floor with a heavy, final thud and did not move again. The cabin was plunged into a sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of the growing fire. Jebediah, who had been locked in a struggle with Wade, froze, his head snapping up. He stared at the dead man on the floor, then at Clara, who stood trembling against the wall, her face a pale mask of shock. He looked at the rifle lying between them. The fight, the fury, seemed to drain out of him. This was not what he had signed up for. He was a ranch foreman, not a killer, and he was certainly not prepared to die for Alistair Finch's pride. He shoved Wade away and scrambled to his feet. He gave Clara one last, terrified look before turning and bolting out the door, disappearing into the night. The man who had started the fire was already gone, having fled at the sound of the gunshot. They were alone, alone with the dead man, the ringing silence, and the fire that was now consuming the cabin, its flames roaring up the walls, eating away at the roof, turning their small, precious haven into a funeral pyre. The roar of the flames was a living, hungry thing, a beast consuming their small world. For a heartbeat. Clara was paralyzed. The ringing in her ears from the gunshot, a high, thin scream. The acrid smoke, a choking fist in her throat. The dead man lay on the floor, a still and terrible thing, his open eyes reflecting the fire. Then she looked at Wade. He was leaning against the wall, his face a ghastly, bloodless white in the flickering hell light, one hand pressed tight against the bloody slash on his ribs. He was alive, but he was badly hurt. The sight of his pain, his vulnerability, was a clarion call that cut through her shock. "Wade," she cried, her voice tearing through the roar. He looked at her, his eyes glazed with pain but still fiercely intelligent. "Go!" he rasped, trying to push himself off the wall. "Clara, run!" She didn't even consider it. The thought of leaving him was more terrifying than the fire, more horrifying than the dead man at her feet. The woman who had fled her father's ranch was gone, burned away in the flames of this cabin. A new woman stood in her place, and this woman did not run. "No," she said, the word a raw, unshakable vow. "Not without you." She crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing his good arm and pulling it over her shoulders. His weight was immense, a dead, sagging burden, and he groaned in agony as she moved him. "Lean on me," she commanded, her voice a stranger's, hard and certain. Together, they stumbled out of the inferno and into the cool, dark night. The heat at their backs was intense, the fire casting their lurching shadows long and monstrous before them. They didn't look back. They couldn't. The cabin, their brief and beautiful home, was now a pyre, and to look back was to invite a grief she did not have time for. She half dragged, half carried him away from the burning light, into the deep shadows of the aspen grove where the darkness was a comforting blanket. Every step was a monumental effort. Wade tried to help, his legs stumbling, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The rain-softened ground sucked at her boots, and the low branches of the trees tore at her dress and hair. She didn't notice. Her world had narrowed to a single, desperate purpose, getting him to safety. 100 yards from the fire, she found what she was looking for, a low, thick outcrop of rock at the base of the mesa, forming a shallow overhang, a natural lean-to that would offer some meager protection from the elements and the night. It was cold. It was exposed, but it was out of sight. She eased him down, his back against the stone. He slumped, his head falling forward, his consciousness finally surrendering to the pain and blood loss. For a moment, a wave of pure, cold panic washed over her. He was so still, so pale. She pressed her trembling fingers to the side of his neck, searching for a pulse. She found it, a faint, thready beat against her fingertips. He was alive. The relief was so profound it left her weak. But there was no time for weakness. The night was cold, and his wounds were bleeding freely. If she didn't do something, he would die. The fire from the burning cabin cast enough ambient light for her to see. She looked at his injuries, her stomach churning, forcing herself to be clinical, to be the healer he needed her to be. The blow from the club had clearly done serious damage to his shoulder. It was already swelling to a grotesque size. But it was the knife wound that was the most immediate danger. It was a long, deep gash across his ribs, sluggishly seeping dark blood that soaked his shirt and trousers. She needed bandages. She needed water. She had nothing. Then she looked down at herself, at the tattered, filthy remnants of what was once a fine silk wedding dress. It was the last vestige of her old life, a symbol of the gilded cage she had fled. Without a moment's hesitation, she grabbed the hem of her petticoat, the last layer that still had some clean, white fabric, and ripped. The sound of tearing cotton was loud and violent in the quiet night. She tore strip after long strip, her hands working with a feverish efficiency. She took his canteen, grateful to find it was still half full, and poured a little of the precious water onto a strip of cloth. Her hands, which had shaken so violently when holding the rifle, were now surprisingly steady. She gently, carefully, began to clean the blood from around the gash on his side. He moaned in his unconscious state, his body twitching with pain, but he did not wake. As she worked, the shock of what had happened in the cabin began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She had taken a life. The knowledge of it settled deep in her bones, a heavy, permanent weight. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound and terrible sorrow. She had killed a man. She had looked into his eyes and had made the conscious choice to end his existence. The act had changed her, had irrevocably altered the landscape of her soul. She had crossed a border and knew, with absolute certainty, that she could never go back. But as she cleaned Wade's wound, her hands moving with a purpose she had never known, she felt something else, too, a new and unfamiliar feeling, rising from the ashes of her old self. It was a fierce, protective resolve. She had killed to save him. She had taken a life to protect a life that had become more precious to her than her own. And in that terrible, brutal calculus, she found no regret. Only a grim, unshakable certainty that she would do it again. She folded a thick pad from the cleanest strips of cloth and pressed it firmly against the wound to staunch the bleeding. She then wrapped another long strip tightly around his torso, binding the makeshift dressing in place. Her work was clumsy, amateurish, but it was the best she could do. She did the same for his shoulder, creating a sling to immobilize his arm. Her movements gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. Wade was still unconscious, his breathing shallow but even. The bleeding from his side seemed to have slowed. She had done all she could. Now, all that was left was to wait, to watch, to pray. She kept vigil as the hours of the night crawled by. She built a tiny, smokeless fire from dry twigs, shielding its meager light with her body. She sat beside Wade, listening to every breath, every pained murmur, ready to offer him a sip of water or simply the reassurance of her presence. The body of the man she had killed lay in the darkness near the smoldering ruins of the cabin. But she did not think of him. She thought only of the man breathing beside her. In the long, silent hours before dawn, with the world hushed and waiting, Clara finally had time to think. She thought of the woman she had been just weeks ago, a woman whose greatest act of defiance was to run away. She remembered her passionate declaration to Wade, that she was proud of being a woman who had kept herself. She had been so proud of her purity, of the invisible shield of her innocence. It had been her armor, the one thing she owned in a world that sought to own her. That pride felt like a child's vanity now. It was a pride based on an absence, on a lack of experience. It was the pride of a closed door, of a locked room. What she felt now was something entirely different. It was a pride forged in fire and blood. It was the pride of action, not of inaction. It was the pride of having stood her ground, of having protected, of having fought for something beyond herself. The first pride had been about saving her own soul. This new pride was about saving his life, and it was infinitely, immeasurably greater. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the tops of the eastern mesas, Wade's eyes fluttered open. He blinked a few times, trying to focus. His gaze was hazy with pain, but it found her. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry, cracked rasp. "I'm here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She moved closer, offering him a sip of water from the canteen. He drank greedily, then sank back, his eyes closing for a moment. "The cabin?" he murmured. "It's gone," she said softly. "They're gone." He opened his eyes again, and this time they were clearer. He looked at her, truly looked at her, taking in her face, smudged with soot and tears, her hair a wild tangle, her dress torn and blood-stained. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a new and unfamiliar strength, a core of tempered steel. He remembered the chaos, the fight, the deafening roar of his own rifle in her hands. He tried to sit up, but a sharp, agonizing pain shot through him, and he fell back with a gasp. "Don't move," she said, her hand gently pressing on his good shoulder. "You're hurt badly." He looked at the makeshift bandage around his chest, at the sling immobilizing his arm. He looked at the torn strips of her petticoat. He understood. She had done this. She had saved him. They were silent for a long time. The only sounds the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk greeting the new day. The world felt raw, new, and uncertain. It was Clara who finally broke the silence, her voice a low, wondering whisper, as if she were speaking a truth she had only just discovered about herself. "I remember telling you how proud I was," she began, her gaze fixed on the glowing embers of their tiny fire, "proud of keeping myself safe, of my innocence." She gave a small, sad shake of her head. "That seems like a lifetime ago, like another person." She looked at him, her eyes clear and filled with a profound, sober light. "Tonight," she said, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "I think for the first time in my life, I know what it really means to be proud. I'm proud that I wasn't helpless. I'm proud that I knew how to protect someone else." She looked down at her hands, still stained with his blood and the grime of the fight. "I'm proud that I could protect you." He watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His own pride, the fierce, masculine pride that had driven him to fight 3 men alone, had been shattered. He had failed, he had been beaten, and she had been the one to save him. A lesser man would have been shamed by it. But as he looked at the woman before him, at the incredible, terrifying strength she had found within herself, he felt no shame. He felt only a deep, overwhelming, and humbling awe. Slowly, with a pained effort, he lifted his right hand, his good hand. He reached out and gently, reverently, placed it over hers where it rested on her lap. Her hand was small and cold beneath his, but he could feel the tremor of the immense power that lay within it. "I am proud, too, Clara," he said, his voice low and raspy, but filled with an unshakable conviction. He waited until she met his gaze, holding her there with the sheer force of his will. "But not because you protected me," he continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I'm proud because when the time came, you chose. You weren't forced to it. You weren't just scared into it. You chose me." He took a ragged breath, the effort costing him, but his eyes never wavered. "Everything you've done since I found you has been your own choice. Running, trusting, fighting, staying. That's a bravery that has nothing to do with a gun." His words were a quiet absolution in the cold morning air, a validation that settled deeper than pride. They were a foundation upon which something new and fragile could be built, but foundations required solid ground. And the smoldering, blackened ruin of the cabin was a testament to how precarious their world still was. The days that followed were a blur of pain and perseverance, a slow, arduous climb back toward life. Wade's recovery was a battle fought in silence and shadow. He was consumed by fever for 2 days, his body a furnace, his sleep troubled by fragmented nightmares. In those long, terrifying hours, Clara became his anchor. She was no longer just his nurse. She was his guardian, his provider, his entire world. She learned to hunt, not with the rifle she still couldn't look at without trembling, but with snares she fashioned from vines and her own hair, catching scrawny rabbits and ground squirrels. She learned which roots were safe to eat and which berries would ease a fever. She spent hours by the stream, washing the torn strips of her dress and rebandaging his wounds, her touch gentle but her will unbending. She watched him, her heart a constant, aching knot of fear. She saw the lines of agony etched on his face in his sleep, the way his good hand would clench into a fist. She saw the strength of his body warring with the weakness of his injuries. And in his moments of lucidity, she saw the frustration and the shame in his eyes. He was a man accustomed to being the protector, and to be so utterly dependent was a torment for him. He would try to sit up, to help, and she would gently but firmly push him back down. "Rest," she would command, her voice soft but laced with the same steel she had found when she'd pulled the trigger. "Your only job right now is to heal. I will handle the rest." He had no choice but to surrender, to place his life entirely in her hands. And in that surrender, a new and profound intimacy grew between them. It was an intimacy born not of passion, but of utter necessity and complete trust. She spoon-fed him broth she made from boiled roots and scraps of meat. She helped him drink when he was too weak to lift the canteen. She saw him at his most vulnerable, stripped of his strength and his stoicism, and she did not flinch. She simply cared for him. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to mend. The fever broke, the color returned to his face. He could sit up against the rock for hours at a time, watching her with a quiet, unreadable intensity. He started to talk more, not of the fight, but of the future. He would watch the slow, patient work of a spider weaving its web, and he would say, "She knows her business. Start with a strong anchor, and the rest will hold." One morning, nearly 2 weeks after the fire, he stood on his own for the first time. He was unsteady, his face pale with the effort, but he was standing. He walked, slowly, to the edge of the grove and stared at the blackened footprint of the cabin. The stone chimney stood like a lonely tombstone, the rest a chaotic jumble of charred logs and ash. "It was a good spot," he said, his voice rough. "It was a home," Clara answered quietly, coming to stand beside him. He looked at the ruin for a long time. Then he looked at the sky, at the towering mesas, at the vast, unforgiving land that stretched in every direction. He could have left. He could have said the danger was too great, that they needed to move on, to disappear into the wilderness again. But he didn't. Instead, he looked at her. "The bones are good," he said, his gaze returning to the stone chimney. A man could build on that again. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. A man could. And so, the work began. It was a resurrection. They were rebuilding not just a structure of wood and stone, but their own lives, from the ashes up. At first, Wade was too weak for the heavy lifting. He became the architect, the teacher. He showed Clara how to salvage the unburnt logs, how to use his axe to strip the charred wood away, revealing the clean, strong heartwood beneath. He taught her how to mix a mortar of mud and grass to patch the chimney, how to read the grain of a piece of wood to know where it would be strongest. Her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and capable. She learned the heft of an axe, the satisfying bite of a sharp blade into pine. She worked from sunup to sundown, her body aching with a weariness that was deep and satisfying. This was not the helpless exhaustion of flight, but the productive fatigue of creation. With every log she salvaged, with every stone she cleared, she felt as if she were clearing away a piece of her old, useless self. As Wade's strength returned, the pace of the work quickened. He began to fell new trees from the grove, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing through the canyon. He was still careful of his shoulder, but a fierce, determined energy drove him. He was a man reclaiming his strength, his purpose. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. He would hew the logs, and she would help him lever them into place. He would notch the corners, and she would chink the gaps with mud and moss. They were building more than a cabin. They were building a partnership. There were no orders given, no pleas made. They simply moved in concert, anticipating each other's needs. A look or a nod conveying more than a whole sentence. They were two solitary people who, in the crucible of shared labor and shared survival, were slowly, irrevocably, becoming a single unit. While Wade built the walls, Clara brought the life. She took seeds from the wildflowers that grew in the sunny patches at the canyon's edge and planted a small, hopeful garden along the foundation of what would become the porch. It was an act of audacious faith, a promise of beauty in a world of harsh utility. She found wild mint and planted it near the door. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth until they were clean. She was not just helping to build a shelter, she was creating a home. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh heat of summer softened into the golden, hazy days of autumn. The cabin stood finished, stronger and tighter than the one before. It was small, just a single room, but it was theirs, built by their own 4 hands. The aspen trees in the grove turned a brilliant, shimmering gold, and Clara's small garden bloomed with a defiant riot of purple and yellow asters. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in breathtaking shades of crimson and gold, Wade stood before the finished cabin. He was not looking at the cabin, but out at the vast expanse of the land, the same land that had nearly killed them. He was whole again. The wounds on his body now faded scars, a testament to what they had survived. He looked different to Clara. The haunted, solitary look of the wanderer was gone. In its place was the quiet, steady strength of a man who had found his place in the world. Clara came to stand beside him. She was different, too. The tattered remnants of her wedding dress had long since been replaced by a simple, practical dress she had fashioned from a spare blanket. Her skin was tanned by the sun. Her hair was tied back in a simple braid, and her eyes held a calm, clear confidence that had not been there before. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sky bleed its colors across the horizon. The world was vast and silent, and they were 2 small figures in its immense landscape. But they were not lost. They were not hiding. They were home. Clara turned to him. The time for silent gestures, for unspoken understandings, was over. It was time for the truth, spoken plainly, chosen freely. She reached out and placed her hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its strong, steady beat beneath her palm, a rhythm that had become the anchor of her life. He looked down at her, his expression soft in the dying light, his eyes asking the question he would never speak. "I choose you, Wade," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a profound, unshakable certainty. She looked him directly in the eye, wanting him to see the truth of her words, the depth of her decision, not to run from something, but to stay for someone. It was the culmination of her entire journey. It was the final, definitive act of the woman who keeps herself. She was not giving herself away. She was not surrendering. She was choosing. She was offering the one thing that was truly hers to give, not out of fear or necessity, but out of a love that had been forged in fire, tested by hardship, and proven in the quiet, steady rhythm of their shared lives. A slow smile spread across Wade's face. It was a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it transformed his rugged features, making him look younger, freer than she had ever seen him. It was the smile of the thirsty man who has finally found his spring, of the wanderer who has finally found his home. He slowly, reverently, removed his hat, holding it in his hand in a gesture of profound respect. He looked at her, his eyes shining with an emotion so deep, so powerful. It needed no words, but he gave them to her anyway, a vow spoken into the vast, beautiful twilight. "I choose you, too, Clara," he said, his voice thick with a feeling he had spent a lifetime holding back, every single day. He leaned down and, for the first time, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate need. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was gentle and sure, and it tasted of wood smoke and autumn and forever. They stood there as the last light of the sun faded and the first stars began to appear in the deep purple sky. They stood in the vast, open heart of the wilderness, between the home they had built and the endless horizon. They stood with no coat to hide beneath, no shadows to conceal them, nothing to shield them from the world or from each other. They had nothing but their own 2 arms to belong to, and it was, at long last, more than enough. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your location and your thoughts on Clara and Wade's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you really enjoyed it, please consider hitting that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.